I came to the bank to withdraw $100 in cash, but the manager went pale. "Ma'am, have you seen your balance?" It was $18 million. I had never had that kind of money. What happened the next day? Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I always thought my life was simple. That was the word I used. Simple. Not poor, not unhappy. Simple. I had a 2-bedroom house on Elmwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, a reliable Honda that I'd paid off 3 years ago, and a pension from 22 years of teaching 8th grade English at Jefferson Middle School. I had a small vegetable garden in the backyard. I had a cat named Biscuit. I had Sundays at my sister Carol's house, eating her terrible lasagna and pretending it was wonderful. That was my life after Richard died, and I had learned to find it enough. Richard had passed 2 years before. A heart attack, sudden, no warning. We'd been married for 27 years. He ran a mid-sized financial consulting firm downtown, Mitchell & Harmon Associates, with his business partner, Victor Harmon. I had never been deeply involved in the business. I signed documents when Richard asked me to, attended Christmas parties, smiled at clients. I trusted him completely. That trust, I would later understand, was the most expensive thing I ever owned. After Richard died, Victor had been kind in the way powerful men are kind when kindness costs them nothing. He sent flowers to the funeral. He handled the dissolution of Richard's share of the firm. I received a settlement, $340,000, which I placed carefully in a savings account and tried not to touch. It was enough to supplement my pension. It was enough to keep the house. I thanked Victor, and we stopped seeing each other. That should have been the end of our story. But in the months that followed, I began noticing small, irritating things. Twice I received letters addressed to a bank I had never heard of. First Continental Private Banking, redirected to my home address. I assumed it was a mistake and threw them away. Once, a man called my home number and asked for the account holder, and when I said I didn't know what he was talking about, he apologized and hung up. I thought nothing of it. What was there to think? Then came the Tuesday in March, when I needed exactly $100 in cash for my neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, who was selling me a small antique dresser and preferred not to use Venmo. I drove to my branch of First National at Ease, the bank I had used for 30 years, parked in the lot, and walked inside. The teller was a young woman named Destiny, whose name tag I still remember perfectly. She typed in my account number, looked at the screen, and her expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight stillness, the way a person freezes when they see something they weren't expecting. "One moment, ma'am," she said. She walked to the back. That took 4 minutes. I counted. When she returned, she had the branch manager with her, a trim man in his 50s named Gerald Marsh, who introduced himself with a handshake that was slightly too firm. He led me to his glass-walled office and asked me to sit down. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "have you recently made any large deposits or authorized any transfers into this account?" "No," I said. "I'm here to take out $100. He turned the monitor to face me. The balance on my savings account, the account where I kept my settlement money and my pension deposits, read $18,247,614.43. I stared at it. My first thought was absurd. I'm going to need a bigger vegetable garden. My second thought was the correct one. Something is very, very wrong. "That can't be right," I said. "It came in over several wire transfers," Gerald said carefully, "over the past 4 months, in increments." He slid a printed transaction history across the desk. I looked at it without picking it up, the way you look at a dead animal on the road, needing to see it but not wanting to touch it. 12 separate transfers, the smallest $800,000, the largest just under $2 million. All from a holding company called Meridian Capital LLC. I didn't recognize the name. I told him so. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to be transparent with you. An account that receives transfers of this structure, these amounts, these intervals, is subject to automatic reporting to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Our compliance department flagged it this morning. He paused. This is already on the radar of federal regulators. The word federal landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. I drove home without the $100 for Mrs. Paulson's dresser. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, watching Biscuit watch me from the living room window. I kept thinking about those letters I had thrown away, about the man who had called asking for the account holder, about Richard, who had been my husband for 27 years, who had asked me to sign documents I never read carefully enough, about Victor Harmon, who had shaken my hand at Richard's funeral and said, "If you ever need anything, Sarah, anything at all, please don't hesitate." The air in my car felt very thin. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with Biscuit curled against my legs and stared at the ceiling and tried to build a picture from the pieces I had. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle in the dark. I could feel the edges, but I couldn't see how they connected. By 3 a.m, I had gotten up, made myself chamomile tea, and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad. I am a former English teacher. When I don't understand something, I write it down. Writing has always helped me see. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What I know." Beneath it, I listed the facts carefully. $18 million in my account, 12 transfers over 4 months. A company called Meridian Capital LLC, a bank, First Continental Private Banking, that I had never opened an account with, but that had apparently been sending me mail, a dead husband who had run a financial firm, a living business partner who had handled the dissolution of that firm. Then I turned the page and wrote, "What I don't know." That list was much longer. The fear came in waves. Real fear, not the abstract anxiety of a bad day, but the cold, specific fear of a person who understands they are standing in the middle of something dangerous without knowing its shape. Because I had watched enough news to understand what happened to people whose bank accounts held $18 million in suspicious wire transfers. The government didn't ask politely. The government froze accounts, conducted audits, issued subpoenas. It didn't matter that I hadn't done anything. Innocence, I knew, was something you had to prove. And there was the other fear, the one I didn't want to look at directly, that the money had come from Victor, that Richard had known about it, that my husband of 27 years had been involved in something I had been carefully kept away from, that my settlement, my clean, respectable $340,000 had perhaps not been as clean as I thought. I pressed my pen hard against the legal pad and wrote one sentence. I am not going to be destroyed by this. I underlined it twice. By morning, I had a rudimentary plan. The first thing I needed was a lawyer, not a general attorney, but a specialist. Criminal defense or financial fraud, someone who operated in the territory I had just accidentally entered. I couldn't call a friend for a referral because I couldn't tell anyone about this yet. The branch manager's words sat in my mind, already on the radar of federal regulators. If federal investigators were already looking at my account, I needed counsel before I spoke to anyone official. I also needed information. The letters from First Continental Private Banking. I had thrown 2 of them away, but the trash hadn't been collected since last Thursday. I went to the recycling bin in my garage at 6 in the morning in my bathrobe and dug through it until I found one of them, crumpled and faintly coffee-stained. I smoothed it on the kitchen counter. It was a monthly statement for an account in my name, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, at First Continental Private Banking, a private bank headquartered in the Cayman Islands with a branch office in Miami. The account had been opened 3 years ago. That was 1 year before Richard died. The statement showed a balance of 0. The account had apparently been used as a pass-through, not a holding account. Someone had opened a bank account in my name, in the Cayman Islands, 3 years ago, without my knowledge, without my signature, or, and this thought was even worse, with a signature that I had provided without understanding what I was signing. Richard had asked me to sign papers, many papers over the years. I had signed them. I sat down on my kitchen floor, just sat down, right there on the linoleum, with the statement in my hand. Biscuit came and butted his head against my knee. "I know," I told him. "I know." But I stood back up. That is the thing about being 52 years old and having survived a husband's death and 22 years of 8th graders who didn't want to learn. You know how to stand back up. By 9 o'clock, I had found, through online research, a white-collar criminal defense attorney named Patricia Osei, who had handled federal financial fraud cases and had a 4.9 rating on every platform I could find. Her office was in downtown Columbus. She had a consultation fee of $400. I called and made an appointment for the following morning. Then, and this was perhaps the most important decision of that first day, I did not call Victor Harmon. I wanted to. The pull to call him was almost physical, the instinct to reach for the familiar adult in the room. But something stopped me. It was quiet and certain. That's something. I picked up my phone, scrolled to his name, stared at it for a long moment, and put the phone face down on the table. Not yet, I thought. Not until I know what I'm dealing with. That instinct saved me. I would understand that later, fully and completely. But even then, sitting in my kitchen on a Wednesday morning with a $400 consultation appointment and a Cayman Islands bank statement, I felt the first small, fragile stir of something that wasn't fear. It was the beginning of a plan. Patricia Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a building on High Street, and it looked exactly the way you would want a serious lawyer's office to look. Clean, spare, no clutter, a single-frame degree on the wall, and a view of the city that suggested competence rather than extravagance. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with natural hair and a manner that was warm and completely unsentimental at the same time. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I could express. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "the first thing I want you to understand is that you are not in legal jeopardy for the presence of those funds in your account. Not yet, not automatically. The law recognizes the concept of unwitting receipt, but you are in a very sensitive position, and what you do in the next 2 weeks will determine a great deal." She explained the landscape. Federal financial regulators, likely FinCEN, possibly the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, would be reviewing the transactions flagged by the bank's compliance department. If they connected the funds to fraudulent activity, they would move to freeze the account. I would then have the right to contest the freeze and establish that I had no knowledge of or participation in the transfers. "But here's what I need from you," Patricia said, leaning forward. "Everything. Every document Richard ever had you sign, every account you are named on, every communication you've had with Victor Harmon since Richard's death." I gave her the Cayman Islands statement. I told her about the other letters I had discarded. I told her about the phone call. I told her about the settlement. She examined the statement carefully. First Continental Private Banking, she said, almost to herself. They've appeared in 2 other cases I'm aware of. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I went home and spent the next 3 days going through every document in Richard's home office, a room I had barely entered in 2 years, because grief is strange and sometimes takes the shape of avoidance. I found files. Richard had been organized, which was both helpful and painful. The pain of seeing his handwriting on folders, the helpfulness of the folders themselves. On the 3rd day, I found it. It was in a manila envelope at the back of the lowest drawer, behind a hanging file of old tax returns. It contained a set of documents related to the formation of a limited liability company, Meridian Capital LLC, registered in Delaware in 2019. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington. There were 2 listed members, Richard Allen Mitchell and Victor James Harmon. The company, according to its operating agreement, was established to manage and distribute investment assets on behalf of institutional clients. Meridian Capital LLC, the same company that had wired $18 million into my account. My hands were not entirely steady as I photographed every page with my phone. I also found something else, a life insurance policy I didn't know existed, naming me as sole beneficiary, issued by a company I'd never heard of, worth $2 million. It had never been paid out. I had never filed a claim because I hadn't known it existed. I sent everything to Patricia that evening. She called me the next morning at 8 o'clock. Sarah. She had shifted to my first name, which felt significant. The transfers are consistent with a pattern used in asset concealment. Someone was moving money through a chain of accounts to obscure its origin. Your account, and the Cayman account in your name, appears to have been used as a final stop, a place to park funds after they'd been laundered through multiple intermediaries. She paused. I believe your husband's account was used without your knowledge, but Victor Harmon signed the Meridian LLC operating agreement as a co-manager. He had equal authority over its accounts. So Victor transferred the money to me, I said. It looks that way. The question is why? We thought about it together in silence for a moment. If investigators found the money at Meridian, I said slowly, it would lead directly to him. But if it was in my account, he could claim Richard acted alone, Patricia said, and that you were a knowing participant. A grieving widow sitting on $18 million of dirty money is a very convenient story for a man who needs someone to blame. The clarity of it was almost physical, a cold, clean click, like a lock turning. Victor had used me. He had planned to use me. He had quite possibly spent the past 2 years quietly arranging for me to become the person federal investigators would look at while he walked away clean. How long had he been planning it? Since before Richard died? Had Richard known? I didn't have answers yet. But for the first time since sitting in Gerald Marsh's glass-walled office, I wasn't only afraid, I was angry. And anger, I had learned from 22 years of managing 8th graders, is a much more useful fuel than fear. Patricia had already begun drafting a formal, proactive disclosure to FinCEN, establishing my cooperation before investigators came to me. That was the move. Get ahead of it, control the narrative, position myself as a witness rather than a suspect. The chessboard was being set. I hadn't yet seen all the pieces, but I could see the shape of the game. What I didn't know was that Victor could too. Patricia filed the proactive disclosure to FinCEN on a Friday. By Monday, we had been contacted by a special agent named Denise Calhoun from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Columbus. Patricia negotiated the terms, I would cooperate fully, provide all documentation, answer all questions, in exchange for being formally designated as a cooperating witness rather than a subject of investigation. Agent Calhoun, a brisk, quietly methodical woman who wore the same navy blazer to every meeting, reviewed the documents I had found in Richard's office and said very little, which is how competent federal investigators operate. I had also, on Patricia's advice, quietly retained a separate civil attorney named Howard Briggs to address the status of the $18 million. The money was frozen pending the federal investigation, which was expected. What mattered was establishing my legal claim to it, not necessarily to keep all of it, but to establish that I was its rightful custodian, which complicated any attempt by Victor to make it disappear. It was Howard Briggs who, on a Tuesday afternoon 12 days after my visit to the bank, called me with the piece of information that changed the atmosphere of everything. "Sarah, I've had someone run a quiet search on Meridian Capital LLC's financial history. The company received funds from 17 institutional clients over a period of 4 years. Those clients were pension funds, 3 of them, all mid-size, all in the Midwest. The money that moved through Meridian was not investment returns. It was principal. The clients believe their money is invested. It isn't. It's been systematically extracted." He paused. "We're talking about a Ponzi structure, approximately $40 million total." I sat with that for a moment. $40 million. Pension funds, real people, teachers, firefighters, hospital workers, whose retirement money had been quietly stolen. "Richard," I said. "Richard was a signatory. His culpability is a separate legal question, given that he's deceased, but Victor Harmon is alive, and if the FBI develops what you've given them, he's going to prison," I said. "If the investigation proceeds correctly, yes, a long time." That was the day Victor called me. I almost didn't answer. The call came at 7 in the evening while I was eating soup at my kitchen table. I looked at his name on the screen and then, because Patricia had told me to document all contact, I answered and put him on speaker. "Sarah." His voice was the same as always, warm, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being trusted. "I heard you've been speaking with federal investigators." "Hello, Victor," I said. "I wanted to reach out personally. This situation, the money in your account, I want you to know that Richard set this up without my knowledge. I was as blindsided as you were. I think we should talk, you and I, work together to explain things to the right people." I said nothing. "Sarah, I'm trying to help you." A pause, and then the warmth in his voice shifted, just fractionally, like a cloud passing over the sun. "There are aspects of your husband's business practices that, if they came to light in the wrong context, could reflect very poorly on you. Documents you signed, decisions he made in your name." Another pause. "I'd hate for you to be caught in something that was entirely Richard's doing." It was a threat, dressed in concern, but a threat. "I appreciate your call, Victor," I said. "My attorney is handling all communications related to this matter. Please contact her directly." I gave him Patricia's name and hung up. Then I sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then I called Patricia and played her the recording, because I had, on her earlier advice, installed a call recording app on my phone. "He just made it worse for himself," Patricia said, and I could hear the particular satisfaction of a lawyer whose opponent has made an unforced error. That's witness tampering at minimum, possibly obstruction. 2 days later, Victor appeared in the parking lot of my local grocery store. I was walking to my car with 2 bags of groceries when I saw him leaning against a black SUV, dressed in a suit, watching me. He had brought someone with him, a younger man I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, who stood slightly behind him. Sarah. Victor walked toward me. I don't think you understand the position you're in. I think I understand it very well, I said. $18 million in your account, your name on a Cayman Islands account, your signature on multiple Meridian documents. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. You could cooperate with me and this all goes away. Or you can fight it, and I'll make sure every investigator in Columbus knows that Richard acted on your instructions. I looked at him. I looked at the man behind him. I thought about pension funds. I thought about teachers and firefighters. You should speak with my attorney, I said, and walked to my car. My hands were shaking when I put the groceries in the trunk, but he didn't see that because I waited until the door was closed. I reported the incident to Agent Calhoun the same afternoon. She was very interested. After that, after the phone call, after the parking lot, after 2 weeks of documents and disclosures and attention that had wound itself around every moment of every day, I took 3 days. I drove to my sister Carol's house in Cincinnati and told her only that I was dealing with some complicated financial stuff from Richard's estate and needed company. She asked no detailed questions. She made her terrible lasagna. We watched old movies. I slept 8 hours each night. It was the most important rest I took that year. I came back from Carol's house on a Sunday evening feeling like a different woman than the one who had left. Not transformed. I'm too old and too practical to believe in transformations, but steadied. There is a difference between fear that paralyzes and fear that informs, and somewhere between Carol's lumpy guest bed and her terrible lasagna, I had crossed from one side to the other. The first call came on Monday. It wasn't Victor this time. It was a man named Dale Whitfield who introduced himself as a business associate of Victor's and a mutual friend of Richard's. I had never heard his name. He was friendly, relaxed, and spoke in the kind of measured, reasonable tones that suggested he had rehearsed the conversation. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sure you've been under an enormous amount of stress. These investigations are brutal on families, especially widows who are essentially innocent bystanders. Victor genuinely wants to find a path forward that protects everyone. He paused. The money in your account, it doesn't need to be a federal matter. It can be resolved privately, cleanly, without any of this becoming part of the public record. Victor is prepared to make arrangements. You'd be compensated fairly. Your name would be kept entirely clear, and everyone goes home. Compensated fairly. I almost laughed. What you're describing, I said, sounds like asking me to participate in obstruction of justice and accept payment for it. A brief silence. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I know you wouldn't, I said. Mr. Whitfield, please don't call me again. I ended the call and forwarded the recording to Patricia within the hour. She called back quickly. They're getting nervous. This is good. I understood what she meant. Victor's attempt to reach me through an intermediary, rather than continuing to contact me directly after the parking lot incident, which he presumably understood had been reported, showed he was recalibrating. He was still trying to negotiate. That meant he was not yet confident enough to shift into pure aggression. He's watching me, I thought, trying to read me. And so I became deliberately unreadable. I returned to my regular routines with a completeness that I knew, on some level, was partly performance. I tended my garden. I visited Mrs. Paulson, who had generously held the dresser for me. I went to Sunday dinner at Carol's. If Victor had anyone watching me, and I believed he did because the parking lot SUV had appeared near my street twice since, they would report back, widow going about her life, unthreatened, unconcerned. But the real work of those weeks happened quietly. Agent Calhoun's team had subpoenaed records from First Continental Private Banking. They had also, she told me in one of our regular calls, identified wire transfer records connecting Meridian Capital LLC to 3 overseas shell companies, 2 of them registered in the British Virgin Islands and 1 in Panama. The money trail was complex but not unbreakable. Financial forensics was a patient science. The life insurance policy I had found, the $2 million policy I had never filed a claim on, turned out to be something that Patricia identified as significant. It had been purchased by Meridian Capital LLC on Richard's behalf, with premiums paid from a Meridian account. If Richard had died and the policy had been claimed by the proper beneficiary, me, it would have moved $2 million from Meridian into my hands in a way that looked entirely legitimate. A widowed woman receiving her husband's life insurance is not suspicious. It was a beautifully constructed, clean exit ramp from the dirty money, which meant someone had planned from the beginning for Richard to die. I sat with that thought for a long time. Richard's heart attack had been sudden. No prior cardiac history, the doctors had said, which surprised them. An autopsy had not been performed because I had seen no reason to request one. I mentioned this to Agent Calhoun. She was very quiet for a moment. Then she said she would look into it. It was in those weeks that I found my real support. Not from the federal investigators, who were professional but clinical. Not from my attorneys, who were expert but transactional. From a woman named Donna Ferris, whom I met in the waiting room of Patricia's office. Another client, though I didn't know the nature of her case. We struck up a conversation about nothing in particular. The parking situation downtown, the price of coffee, and exchanged numbers. Donna became, over the following weeks, something I hadn't expected to need. A witness to my humanity. She didn't know the details of my situation, only that I was in a legal matter involving my late husband's business. She checked in by text. She brought me soup once when I mentioned I was tired. She had survived her own complicated divorce and carried the particular practical empathy of someone who had been through fire without being destroyed by it. The combination of Donna's presence, Carol's dinners, and the steady accumulation of legal progress gave me something I could not have manufactured on my own. The genuine, quiet confidence of a woman who is doing everything right and knows it. Victor was watching. I could feel it. Let him watch. They came on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the bank visit, just as the light was going golden in my backyard and I was watering my tomatoes. I heard a car in the driveway and looked up to find Victor and a woman I recognized from Richard's old Christmas parties. Greta Harmon, Victor's wife. She was elegant, 50-something, and had always struck me as a woman who had learned to apply the same careful finish to her expressions that she applied to her appearance. Smooth, pleasant, revealing nothing. Victor was carrying flowers, dahlias, Richard's favorite, which Victor certainly knew. Sarah. He spread his hands in an open gesture, the dahlias held loosely, nothing aggressive. I know I've handled some of our recent conversations badly. I'm not good at stress. I said things that came out wrong. He looked genuinely contrite. He was very good. I thought it might be better if Greta and I came in person, as old friends, without lawyers. I set down my watering can. I looked at the dahlias. I looked at Greta, who gave me a soft, sorrowful smile. "Come in," I said. I gave them nothing to drink. I sat across from them in my living room with my hands folded, and I listened. Greta spoke first, which I found interesting. A tactical choice, leading with the softer instrument. She spoke about Richard, how much he had meant to Victor, how this investigation was tearing their family apart, how Victor had dedicated his career to honest work and was now being painted as a villain by people who didn't understand how complex business was. Her eyes were damp. She was, genuinely or not, a compelling speaker. Victor's attorneys believe, Greta said gently, that the strongest path forward for everyone would be for you to simply confirm that Richard managed the Meridian accounts independently, that you signed documents at his instruction without questioning them, which is completely understandable, and that Victor had only a nominal role. She reached forward and touched my hand. You've already cooperated with investigators. You've already proven you're innocent. You don't need to take this further. It doesn't have to destroy Victor, too. I let a short silence sit between us. What you're asking me to do, I said, is provide false testimony to federal investigators. We're asking you to tell the truth, Victor said, his voice even. Richard was the managing partner. I was Victor. I looked at him directly. Your signature is on the Meridian operating agreement as co-manager with equal authority. Your name is on the wire transfer authorizations. The FBI has those documents. The composure on his face thinned, just slightly, just enough. Sarah, you're making an enemy, he said, quietly. Not a shout. The quietness was the point. Then we understand each other, I said. Greta made one more attempt. She spoke about the pension fund investors, carefully, cautiously, framing it as a shared tragedy that had grown out of poor decisions, not criminal intent. She suggested that a civil settlement, negotiated privately, could restore the funds with interest and avoid the ugliness of a public trial. Her voice was warm and reasonable and entirely designed to find the part of me that wanted the easier path. And I felt it. I won't pretend I didn't. The pull of it. The exhaustion beneath the steadiness. The part of me that had cried in the shower twice in the past month and still woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of my own heartbeat. The dahlias were sitting on my coffee table, and they were Richard's favorite, and they smelled like my old garden and my old life. I think you should both go now, I said. Victor stood. The warmth had left his face entirely. What was underneath it was something colder and more honest, a man who had spent his life charming his way into positions of trust and had not fully reckoned with what it looked like when the charm stopped working. You will regret this, he said. Not a shout, not a threat wrapped in pleasantry this time, just a statement, flat and direct, the way a man speaks when he has decided to stop pretending. They left. I watched their car back out of my driveway and disappear around the corner. Then I sat down on my front porch steps and let myself be afraid for exactly 10 minutes. I looked at the street and the neighbor's oak tree and the sky going pink at the edges, and I felt the fear the way you feel weather, as a fact of the world, not a verdict on your character. Then I went inside, called Patricia and reported the visit, and then I made dinner and fed Biscuit and went to bed at 10 o'clock. Regret this. I turned the words over before I fell asleep. I examined them from every angle. And what I found, to my own quiet surprise, was that they did not frighten me the way Victor had intended. They had the opposite effect. They hardened something in me, some final, essential layer that I hadn't known needed hardening. Victor had shown me his face. Now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, 8 months after I had walked into my bank branch to withdraw $100. It was not a trial, not yet. It was a federal civil forfeiture proceeding. the formal legal mechanism by which the government would determine the status of the $18 million in my account. But Agent Calhoun had been specific with me. Based on the evidence her unit had compiled, federal prosecutors were simultaneously preparing a criminal indictment against Victor Harmon. The forfeiture proceeding was the first domino. If it went as expected, the criminal case would follow within weeks. Patricia had spent 7 months preparing. Howard Briggs had filed the civil claim on my behalf. I had spent 7 months answering every question, providing every document, attending every meeting in the calm and cooperative manner of a woman with nothing to hide, because I was a woman with nothing to hide. The proceeding was held in a federal courthouse downtown. The room was smaller than I expected. Not the grand drama of a television courtroom, just a clean, fluorescent federal chamber with a judge who radiated the quiet authority of someone who had heard everything and was not surprised by any of it. Victor's legal team was large. 4 attorneys, all in excellent suits, arranged with the careful deliberateness of people who were being paid to project confidence. Victor himself sat at the table. He looked, for the first time since this began, like a man who was genuinely afraid. Good, I thought. I sat very still and thought it without guilt. Patricia presented our case with the organized precision of someone who had been building toward this moment for months. The Meridian Capital LLC formation documents, the wire transfer records, the Cayman Islands account opened in my name without my authorization. Forensic document analysis had confirmed that the signature on the account opening form was a traced forgery of my actual signature, taken from a document I had signed in 2018, the life insurance policy, the shell company records from the British Virgin Islands and Panama, the recorded phone call in which Victor had unambiguously attempted to pressure me into silence, the parking lot incident documented by Agent Calhoun, the visit to my home in which Victor and his wife had asked me to provide false testimony. Victor's lead attorney, a man named Garrison Price, who had the practiced confidence of a career litigator, presented their counter-narrative, Richard as the primary architect, Victor as a nominal partner, insufficiently attentive to the details of Meridian's operations. My account as a destination, Richard had chosen without Victor's knowledge. It was a coherent story. It might, in another world with different evidence, have been credible. Then Agent Calhoun took the stand. She presented quietly and methodically the results of a financial forensics review of Meridian's transaction records, records that had been subpoenaed from 3 separate banking institutions over 7 months. The wire transfer authorizations for each of the 12 payments into my account bore digital signatures from 2 users, one corresponding to a login credential associated with Richard and one corresponding to a login credential associated with Victor. Every single transfer had required both authorizations, every single one. Victor had not been a passive observer. He had approved each transfer, individually, deliberately. And then Agent Calhoun presented the piece of evidence I had not been expecting, the thing that had apparently been developed quietly, separate from everything I had been directly involved in, the forensic financial analysis of Richard's death. Richard's heart attack had been real, but an analysis of Meridian's financial records revealed that Victor had taken out a life insurance policy, $5 million with a company associated with one of Meridian's shell companies, on Richard's life, 18 months before his death. The policy named Meridian Capital LLC as the beneficiary. It had been claimed. The $5 million had moved through the shell company structure and dispersed. The policy on my life, the $2 million one Dow, had not been claimed because Richard's death had apparently happened before Victor had fully executed whatever the next phase of the plan was. The room was very quiet when Agent Calhoun finished. I looked at Victor. He was looking at the table. His lead attorney leaned over and said something to him in a very low voice. Victor shook his head once, a small, tight movement. His second attorney was already writing something with fast, unhappy motions. "The signature forgery on the Cayman account," Patricia said during her follow-up remarks. "The unauthorized use of Mrs. Mitchell's identity to create a financial instrument. The systematic direction of stolen pension funds into her account, and the simultaneous preparation of a narrative designed to implicate her as a knowing participant. This is not a case of negligent oversight. This is a case of deliberate, premeditated identity exploitation of a trusting widow." Victor looked up then. He looked at me. I held his gaze. He looked away first. Outside the courthouse, in the February cold, Patricia touched my arm briefly. "That went well." "Yes," I said. "How are you feeling?" I thought about it honestly. "Certain," I said. She nodded. "That's the right answer." The civil forfeiture ruling came 14 days later. Judge Patricia Rowe, a coincidence of names that I found quietly amusing, determined that the $18,247,614.43 in my savings account was funds received under circumstances of identity fraud and financial exploitation, that I had no knowing participation in any illegal scheme, and that I was entitled to assert legal ownership of the funds pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. She also referred the matter of the signature forgery to the U.S. Attorney's Office as a separate charge of federal identity fraud. The criminal indictment of Victor James Harmon was filed 22 days after the hearing. 11 counts: wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, identity theft, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of witness tampering, the phone call and the parking lot incident. The indictment also named Dale Whitfield, the business associate who had called me with the offer of private compensation, on 2 counts of obstruction. Victor's legal team entered a not guilty plea. They attempted, over the following 4 months, to negotiate a plea agreement with the U.S. attorney. The negotiations failed. The prosecutors, Agent Calhoun told me quietly, were not interested in a deal. The evidence was strong. The victim class was sympathetic. Pension fund retirees, teachers and firefighters and hospital workers, and the office wanted a trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I was called as a witness on the second day. I sat in the witness box and answered every question Patricia and the prosecutors had prepared me for, and several they hadn't needed to, because the answers were simply true. I described finding the documents in Richard's office. I described the phone call. I described the parking lot. I described Victor and Greta sitting in my living room with dahlias on my coffee table, asking me to lie to federal investigators. Garrison Price cross-examined me for 2 hours. He was good, systematic, patient, probing for inconsistency. He found none, because there were none to find. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On a Wednesday morning, they returned, guilty on all 11 counts. I was in the courthouse hallway when the verdict came through. Patricia had texted me, because I had decided not to be in the courtroom for the reading, not wanting to be photographed by the reporters who had gathered once the trial attracted local press attention. I read the text while sitting on a wooden bench outside the restrooms, next to a water fountain that made a faint mechanical hum. All counts. Guilty. Victor Harmon. I put the phone in my purse. I sat there for a moment watching two courthouse employees walk past with coffee cups, talking about something entirely unrelated to anything happening in my life. A man in a suit spoke on his phone. A woman with a rolling briefcase hurried toward the elevator. The world, still and always, going about its business. I thought about Richard. I thought about what he had known and what he hadn't. Agent Calhoun had told me at the end of the investigation that her team's best assessment was that Richard had been a willing early participant in the Meridian scheme who had, at some point, attempted to extricate himself, and that Victor, recognizing this as a threat, had taken steps to manage it. The life insurance policy on Richard's life, taken out 18 months before his death, was the clearest evidence. Whether Victor had done something active or had simply positioned himself to benefit from Richard's deteriorating health, they could not conclusively prove. Richard had not been innocent. That was a truth I had to carry. But Richard had not created the account in my name. He had not forged my signature. He had not designed the architecture that would have landed me in a federal investigation while Victor walked free. That had been Victor's work, built on Victor's cruelty, targeting a woman Victor had calculated would be isolated, trusting, and too grief-stricken to fight back. He had miscalculated on every single count. Victor Harmon was sentenced 4 months later. 23 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for the first 15. Dale Whitfield received 7 years. The assets of Meridian Capital, LLC were ordered liquidated, with proceeds directed to the pension fund victims. Restitution totaling $38 million was ordered. Of the $18,247,614.43 in my account. A federal judge ruled that $15 million was subject to restitution orders. It would go back to the pension fund victims, as it should. The remaining $3,247,614.43, which represented demonstrable settlement funds from Richard's estate and documented investment returns that predated the fraud, was determined to be legitimately mine. Additionally, the $2 million life insurance policy that I had never known existed and never filed a claim on was now mine to claim. Howard Briggs handled the paperwork. I wrote the first check to the pension fund victims' restitution pool myself, before any court order required it. The amount was everything above what the court had already assigned. I didn't need to do it. Patricia told me I didn't need to do it. I did it anyway. Some things are simply right. I kept enough to pay off the house, fully fund my retirement, and set aside a meaningful amount for Carol's grandchildren's education. The rest went where it belonged. Spring came early that year, or perhaps I was simply paying better attention to it. I replanted my garden in April, expanding the bed along the south fence where the light was best. I added dahlias, Richard's favorite and now mine, not as a statement, not as a reclamation, but because they were beautiful, and I had earned the right to find things beautiful without complication. Biscuit supervised from the porch with his usual expression of deep skepticism toward all human enterprise. I went back to work, not teaching. I was fully retired and intended to stay that way, but as a volunteer reading tutor at a community literacy center 2 mornings a week. The students were adults, mostly, learning to read later in life than the world had allowed them to earlier. There was a dignity in the work that I found more sustaining than I had anticipated. Donna Ferris became a genuine, lasting friend. We had dinner once a week, alternating who cooked, and both of us were honest enough to not pretend otherwise. We ran a 5K together in October. I hadn't run since high school. I finished, which was the only goal that mattered. Agent Calhoun sent me a brief email after Victor's sentencing. Professional, spare, thanking me for my cooperation. I wrote back and thanked her for doing her job with integrity. I framed that email. It represented something I wanted to remember, that institutions, however imperfect, can function. That evidence systematically gathered can speak. Patricia O.C. had lunch with me once, several months after the trial. At the end, she said, "You were the easiest client I've ever had. You did exactly what I told you and never panicked in public." I told her I had panicked extensively in private. She laughed. "That's the correct approach," she said. "Carol still makes terrible lasagna. I still pretend it's wonderful. Some things in life are exactly as they should be." As for Victor Harmon, he entered the Federal Correctional Facility in October. His appeals were methodically denied. Greta filed for divorce 30 days after his sentencing. She moved to Phoenix and took a position in real estate. I wished her nothing. Not good, not ill. Nothing is the cleanest response to people who have tried to use you. The pension fund investors, those teachers and firefighters and hospital workers, received restitution payments covering their principal with interest over the following 2 years. Patricia forwarded me a news article about it with a single line beneath the link. "Because of you." I read that line several times. I kept it. There is a thing that happens when you survive something designed to destroy you. Not a dramatic transformation, not a Hollywood enlightenment, but a quiet recalibration of what you are made of. I had thought of myself, for most of my life, as a woman who was good at making things comfortable, patient, adaptable, easy. I am still those things. But I now know I am also something else. A woman who, when handed an impossible situation, sat down at a kitchen table at 3 a.m. and refused to let it be the end of her story. A woman who found, in the wreckage of a marriage she thought she understood, enough anger to fuel something useful. A woman who kept her receipts, literally and figuratively, and had the presence of mind to record a phone call. My garden blooms in August. The dahlias are spectacular this year. Biscuit sleeps in his patch of afternoon sun, skeptical and content. I drink my coffee and look at the garden through the kitchen window and think, this is mine. I fought for this. No one can take it. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. They said I was lucky. I don't think luck had much to do with it. What saved me was refusing, at 3 a.m, to be a passive character in someone else's story. Was writing things down. Was making the call I was afraid to make. Was saying no when it would have been so much easier to say yes. Richard trusted the wrong man. I almost trusted him, too. Here is what I know now. The people who plan to use you are counting on your silence, your shame, your exhaustion, your belief that someone official will handle it. They are counting on you not to pick up the phone. Pick up the phone. And I have to ask, what would you have done?